Hello, welcome all. It's wonderful to have such a good turnout tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nina Hall, Assistant Professor of International Relations here at SAIS Europe. And I'm delighted to present our guest, Professor Charlie Rogers, who's come from Barcelona, where I hear it's a little warmer. And he'll be presenting tonight on his book, The Origins of Informality, Why the Legal Foundations of Global Governance Are Shifting and Why It Matters. To give you a bit of background to Professor Rogers, he's an assistant professor at Ramón y Cajal, or a Ramón y Cajal Research Fellow at the Institut Barcelona de Estudios Internacionals, or IBEI. And his research explores the dynamics of informal and formal transnational institutions operating across fields like climate change, trade, global finance, and antitrust. He's the author of The Origins of Informality, the book we'll hear about tonight, that came out in 2020, so just before the pandemic, or around the time of the pandemic. So I can imagine didn't get much chance to present in person, which is part of the reason why it's really exciting to have you here today to talk about it. Was also co-author of Transnational Climate Change Governance. And I know he was speaking to some of you earlier about his work in global environmental governance. That book published with Cambridge University Press in 2014 and was named runner-up. The book was named runner-up of the International Studies Association's Harold and Margaret Sprout Award in 2015. That's an award that's given to the best book in environmental studies in that year. So has a lot of expertise in addition to what we'll hear about today on informal and formal governance, also in the environment regime space. In fact, he's published widely, including in journals like Global Environmental Politics, International Interactions, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and Review of International Organizations. He's also worked with the UN, including as a member of the UN High-Level Expert Group on Climate Change, Energy, and Low Carbon Development, and as a contributing author of the 5th Assessment Report of the IPCC. Now, I think for those of you sitting here who are in my class in international relations, tonight's talk is really interesting and exciting because it speaks to questions of international cooperation. Why do states bother to create international institutions? What are they there for? And why might they opt to create informal institutions over formal organizations? And we'll hear more about that distinction. This work will also speak to those of you doing IPE, political economy, trade, finance, because a lot of the examples will come from that space. But I think we can also push Charlie to tell us a bit more about how the implications of this research stretch out into other fields like climate and environment. I also think it's interesting to think a little bit more with his work around what the role of domestic politics is in international relations. And I know that's one of the arguments in the book, and also something that we'll be talking about in the IR theories class. Why do states make the decisions that they do? How do they formulate their preferences? What are the roles of specific institutions? I'm not going to steal any more of your thunder, so I'll leave it at that. And a big warm welcome. We will have time. We'll hear from about 25 minutes or so. I'll ask a few questions and then I'll open up the floor. So feel free to think about your questions already, and hopefully there'll be those of us online. Please also ask questions, as well as those of us in the room. Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I realized that I should probably be standing here because there are people online and they need the microphone. So thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to Nina for facilitating this book talk. As she mentioned, it's a real pleasure to present this book, which actually has had a pretty long gestation period and originally started out as my PhD thesis. At that point in time, I was looking for a topic that was resonating with some of the past work that I've been doing, but striking off into new territory. And as was also mentioned, at that point in time, I'd mainly been looking at the field of climate change, and I've been doing that in order to understand a really important shift that was taking place in that arena, which was this move from governance via public institutions to private ones, or hybrid ones that include mixes of public and private actors working together in order to govern a cross-border problem. And that was one sort of dimension of the shift of global governance that I thought was afoot. But actually, there was another one that was taking place, which caught my attention too. And that was the shift from public forms of governance that rely on binding international law or binding international agreements. And so you can think here in the area of climate change, something like the Kyoto Protocol, right? A very formal international agreement, to a shift towards other kinds of non-binding agreements. And here, the example that was in my mind at the time was the Copenhagen Accord, which is an entirely non-binding international agreement. But alongside it, at that point in time, there were other kinds of organizations that were non-binding in nature, such as the Clean Energy Ministerial or the Major Economies Forum. And what were these things? Why were they being created, and what could they do in the area of climate change? Now, the work ended up taking me quite far from where I started off at that point. And you'll see that most of the examples that I'm going to use here are from the area of the global economy, but these institutions are actually widespread, these informal international organizations that the book focuses on. And hopefully at the end of the talk, we'll return to some of the roots in the field of global environmental politics as well. But before, to get things going, I wanted to begin by, oh, this obviously doesn't want to work. It's fine. Before we begin, I wanted to talk specifically about the central phenomenon at the heart of this book, which is informal international organizations. And I think in order to fix the idea in your mind, I want to start off with something that you already know, which is formal IOs, right? So here, if you're thinking the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, you have the right idea. And so these are incredibly diverse institutions, large, small, different issue areas, but generally speaking, they have three core characteristics, okay? They're created by states. They have some kind of a body that's separate from those member states, usually a secretariat of some kind. And third, they're constituted by an agreement under international law, which has all sorts of domestic and international ramifications, like, for instance, that it has to be ratified domestically in a legislature. There are probably going to be budgetary requirements. There might be oversight requirements. It's actually quite a demanding process in order to create these kinds of institutions. Informal organizations share some of these characteristics. They are also created by states, and this makes it possible to compare them analytically. But there's important differences. One is that on the one hand, they typically have less institutionalized. They might not even have any secretary at all. And if they do, it's generally very small. But the crucial feature that distinguishes between these two kinds of bodies is the fact that informal institutions are constituted outside of the traditional boundaries of international law. There is no effort to invoke legal obligations, and that actually has implications for how these institutions are created. You don't need to ratify a memorandum of understanding, for instance. Now, these international organizations can be found across a wide range of issue areas. I've already mentioned two in the field of climate change, but we can find them in the area of international finance, international security, non-proliferation, and much more beyond. And they've been growing. So this image that you see here shows the growth of informal international institutions over time. And it's based on some data that I collected for this book specifically. And it illustrates the shift that's been taking place. If you go back to the 1950s, when at least this graph starts, informal international organizations were a very small part of the overall landscape of institutions. But today, they constitute as much as 30 to 40% of all of the international organizations that states are currently relying on. And this is actually, I should say, only going up to 2005 in this image. In more recent years, that number is no doubt much larger. And so this graph nicely illustrates sort of the puzzle at the heart of this book. Why are we seeing this shift? And that's what I want to talk with you about today. So I'm first going to focus on a very specific narrow question, which is, why do states choose between these two types of institutional design? Why do they create a formal IO in one instance and an informal IO in another? And I think that's useful because that's going to help us understand this larger question of why informal international organizations have been increasing over time. And the third question that I try to deal with in the book, and then I'll try to speak to in this talk, is what are the implications of this shift on the prospects for global governance? How does this actually matter? And so what I want to do is first talk about the theoretical approach that I take, and that has sort of two versions. One is what I refer to as a static theory that tries to answer that first question: why do states design institutions in one way or another? And then there's a second, more dynamic account, which is derived from that theory that aims to answer the second. I'll talk quickly about, well, as much as I can, about the quantitative and qualitative evidence that I present in the book. And then at the final part of this presentation, I'll return to some of the future and more recent areas or questions that I've been focusing on in my research. So the theory that I develop in this book occurs in two stages. There's first a preference formation stage, where states decide on their own what kind of an institution they'd like in order to resolve some kind of a problem. And that can be either a formal IO or an informal IO. And then a second preference aggregation stage, where they come together around the bargaining table and to try to thrash out what it is this organization is actually going to look like. And different processes are relevant to each of those stages. So here you're looking at the first stage, the preference formation stage, which kicks off with the cooperation problem that states face. This is what creates demand for some kind of an international organization and gets things moving in this model. But cooperation problems do more than just create demand for institutions. They actually create externalities that fall on specific actors within states that become interested in the problem in question, right? That could be Ministry of Trade, deals with trade issues. Ministry of Finance deals with financial issues, and so on. And these institutions occupy distinct positions within domestic institutional structures, which I kind of collapse in the theory to two. So you can distinguish, on the one hand, political institutions, which can be things like the Department of State or a head of state, which either are directly elected or directly accountable to elected officials. And on the other hand, independent agencies, which are institutions like the Federal Reserve or the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States, which are deliberately insulated from those kinds of electoral processes, let's say. And my starting argument in the book is that these have different baseline preferences over the kinds of institutions that they want to create. So consider political institutions first. The key feature of them is that they are very heavily influenced by electoral politics. And given that that's the case, legalization actually helps these actors to do two things. One, it helps to demonstrate leadership vis-a-vis domestic audiences, since formal institutions can be much bigger, much more public entities. But more importantly, the legality of those institutions is really useful to politicians, because it actually helps to lock in the policy preferences more effectively. And by doing that, it can make their promises to the domestic constituencies that they depend on more credible, especially when you consider policymaking over time. And so they tend to prefer, as a baseline preference, a formal international design. But as I mentioned at the outset, formality is actually a high bar to clear in world politics. It can be quite demanding to create international treaties. And so when a politician faces significant domestic constraints, that possibility may be blocked. And that may lead them, in that case, to prefer an informal institution instead, which will satisfy at least some of the constituents in favor of international cooperation, while circumventing those that oppose it. Now consider independent agencies. They, as mentioned, are much more insulated from electoral politics, and that actually is something that they want to maintain, right? When they need to cooperate with others internationally, they typically like to do so as they do domestically on the basis of their discretionary and expert authority. And so they tend to avoid from the outset anything that's going to politicize their activities as much as they can. And so informal organizations actually help them to do that more effectively. And so they try to create those kinds of institutions if they can. But sometimes their activities do become politicized in some way. There could be a crisis of some kind. There could be some other institution that becomes interested in their activity due to a failure. And when those other more political actors start to intervene in their territory, that can then make a formal institution much more likely. Now, remember that this is just the preference formation stage. It's telling you what a state wants at a specific point in time. It's not actually telling you what kind of institution is going to be created. So that we need to consider theories of bargaining, about how states come together at the international level, who have formulated their preferences through domestic political processes and try to determine what kind of an organization they're going to create. Now, sometimes they come together in the international arena and all is good. They realize that actually they share a preference over the formality of an institution. For the same reasons, for different reasons, it doesn't matter. But nevertheless, if they share that preference, then we can predict reasonably well what kind of organization they should be expected to create. In the case of preference divergences, this is much more complicated. We need to incorporate an account of bargaining power. And bargaining theories suggest, on one hand, that informal institutions might actually or actors advocating informal institutions might have a bargaining advantage. And the reason for that is that informal institutions are kind of inherently closer to the status quo ante. And when that's the case, they can more credibly threaten to hold out in negotiations until they get what they want. In comparison to others that want more demanding solutions. So in that case, if that was all that was happening, we would expect others to defer to that position. However, bargaining theory also suggests that there's other moves you can make. If you're a particularly large economy, for instance, you can use side payments, use coercion, persuasion to shift the status quo ante to a new point, illustrated here by T. And that can create an incentive in turn for others to defer to your position, whatever that might be. Okay, so this is essentially determining what kind of institution we would expect to emerge. There's a domestic preference formation stage and then an aggregation stage that tells us what kind of institution will appear. The dynamic account that I develop in the book is derived from this basic theory. It says that if that's the sort of thing that's going on within states, then it's possible that two major shifts that have been occurring within the domestic political arenas of big, powerful states might be behind the growth of informality. And on the one hand, that could be growing polarization within the OECD. Since roughly the 1970s, we've seen increasing contestation, episodes of divided government, all of which makes it more challenging to pursue formal institutions at the international level and can lead politicians to embrace informality in its stead. On the other hand, over the same period, we've seen the growth of the regulatory state. The most important institutional manifestation of which is the creation of independent agencies, which have been drawn increasingly into international politics over roughly the same period. And the argument is carry with them this preference for informality to the international arena. So this is the dynamic account that I explore that's based on that theory. There are, of course, other theoretical explanations out there. One of them is functionalist approaches, which suggest that institutional designs should, broadly speaking, track or match aspects of the cooperation problems that states confront in the international arena, which can lead them to create new kinds of institutions over time as those problems shift, perhaps due to the process of globalization. There's also power-based accounts out there which argue that informality tends to increase when inequality is greater between states or when there's more potential for conflict between states. And so that would locate the growth of informality within sort of larger geopolitical shifts that have been occurring in the global arena. Now, this is what I try to test primarily in this book, and I'll discuss some of the evidence in this presentation. So first of all, when testing the static theory, I'm not going to go through every part of the quantitative analysis. I'll just talk about some of the headline results. The most important thing, I argue, is that the sort of involvement of independent agencies and the level of constraints that we see in powerful states tends to be a very significant predictor of the likelihood that an organization is going to be informal. In contrast, the other explanations have a bit more, the results are a bit more mixed. On the one hand, if you consider power-based theories, for instance, the amount of potential conflict between states seems to be really important for the informality of institution, but the inequality of power on its own doesn't seem to be as important. When it comes to functionalist variables, we see, again, some mixed results. Certain variables, like the potential for opportunism in an issue area, whether it has the structure of a prisoner's dilemma, seems to be important for determining the formality of the institution. But others, like the level of uncertainty in an issue area, seems to be relatively less important. So it's not to say that these other institutions don't have some validity. It's just that certain hypotheses about the variation that they predict is not doesn't seem to be sort of as important, let's say. Now, I also try to use this data in order to test the dynamic account. So what I do here is I've used predicted probabilities from the model that you just saw in order to sort of look at what might have happened historically if it was only an increase in independent agencies or only an increase in globalization that happened. Is kind of a counterfactual analysis. And here, if we do this, we see that the growth of independent agencies over time, and also the growing constraints that policymakers have faced, are quite significant predictors and would have alone significantly increased the level of informality that we see in the global system. And again, if we look at the functionalist explanations, there's some validity there. Globalization may well be playing a role. But interestingly, when it comes to power and interest, despite the fact that they can be really important in individual cases, at least across the states that I look at in this book, it doesn't seem like big geopolitical shifts are behind this trend. But we can return to that later in the conclusion. As mentioned, so large N analysis is really useful for understanding whether the broad patterns that we expect are seen across a fairly wide number of cases. But to understand the kinds of causal mechanisms that link variables, we actually want to look at cases. And in the book, I considered three. So trade and monetary issues, largely looking at the Bretton Woods institutions and the GATT. Banking and securities, which sort of grew significantly in the 1970s, with institutions like the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and the International Organization of Securities Commissions, and antitrust issues, which came to a head in the 1990s. And there I look at the contest between the World Trade Organization and the International Competition Network. So I can only give you the most schematic outline of what I actually cover in these theories, but I'll try to give you just a little bit of a sense of how some of these dynamics work. So if we consider the case of the IMF, for instance, and this is only the preference formation process in the United States, in the case of monetary issues, if we go back to the 1930s, this issue area was primarily being governed by central banks and quite independently of ministries of finance. And if we look at their preferences, they tended to have a very strong sort of mode of operation that was informal in nature, right? Not necessarily informal organizations, but something very close to that. However, in the Great Depression, with the election of Franklin Roosevelt, this area became highly politicized, and politicians entered the scene with people like Henry Morgenthau, and they essentially took over monetary issues. And by the time of the Bretton Woods negotiations, were very strongly in favor of a more formal institution for many of the reasons that I outlined before. If we look at the case of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, a trade institution, the process is a little bit different. Their political institutions were much more important at the very outset. Here, especially the State Department was important. And initially, they wanted a very formal institution, the International Trade Organization, which they were pursuing in the immediate post-war period. However, with the midterm congressional elections in 1946, political constraints grew, the Republicans gained control of Congress, they were much more isolationist, anti-globalist at this point, and that took the ITO off the bargaining table, at least domestically in the United States, and led policymakers to pursue a more informal solution in its stead. So this is naturally just explaining the preference formation process, but the bargaining process aligns as well with the theoretical expectations. So here, in the case of the IMF, the United States wanted a very formal institution. Others had a somewhat weaker preference for that, but they had a big incentive to move in the direction of the United States' desired institution in order to gain access to all sorts of funds in the post-war period. In the case of the GATT, the process is a little bit reversed. Here, the United States, others primarily preferred a formal institution. They would have been very happy with the ITO for the most part. But when the United States preference shifted in favor of greater formality, they again had a strong incentive to move in the direction of its preference, okay? And so that fairly easily actually explains the patterns that we see using the theory that I developed. If we go fast forward to the 1970s, when financial issues started to become a more pressing concern after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, in this particular case, independent agencies were much more important throughout the whole policy process. You can think here about the Federal Reserve, in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other similar institutions that were active in the regulation of global finance at this time. And in all of those cases, they preferred an informal international or organizational design. And there was very limited politicization in this sphere. Despite the fact that they had been encountering financial crises, these were not sufficiently big that policymakers at sort of the international level, when we're thinking about heads of state in the G7 and so on and so forth, they were not as concerned about this at this point, but banking regulators were. And so they shared a preference for informality in this particular case. And we don't see contestation like we saw in the case of the GATT or the IMF cases. It's a much more straightforward example. Now, again, fast forwarding even further into our history of the global political economy, in the case of antitrust issues, these had been sort of simmering throughout the entire post-war period, but became much more of a concern in the 1990s. And kind of similar to the previous case, independent agencies were initially on both sides of the Atlantic, the most important ones. And in this one, we have a very special institution on the European side, which is the European Commission Antitrust or Director General for Competition, which is actually usually traditionally analyzed much as an independent agency, because it actually has, despite the fact that it's part of an international organization, has almost exclusive competence over this area and has more discretionary authority in this area than almost any other issue that with respect to the European Union. And so in line with expectations, it actually had an initial preference for very informal mode of cooperation. But in Europe, those issues became highly politicized in the 1990s as its sort of capacities in this area were questioned by a number of member states and also by Director General for Trade in the European Commission as well. And also as the European Court of Justice actually challenged the informal policymaking abilities of the Commission as well. And so it ended up, as a result of this process, pursuing a much more formal approach through the World Trade Organization. This was actually despite the fact that most in DG competition thought that this was essentially a bad idea. In the case of the United States, where the Department of Justice and the FTC are much more active in these issues, they had maintained throughout this whole period a preference for informality. And by contrast, there was much greater confidence in their regulatory capacities and much less politicization of the issue area. So here, naturally enough, we see a divergence of preferences. The European Union trying to push for some kind of solution in the WTO, the United States embracing something that was eventually going to become the International Competition Network. But key to this bargaining scenario was that the European Union needed to bring the United States on board in order to get its solution over the line in the WTO. And that proved impossible to do, essentially. It dragged its feet, it could veto cooperation, it watered down cooperation in every way possible. And eventually this led the European Union to defer to its solution. It's abandoned its approach in the WTO, and it helped to build up this alternative arrangement, the International Competition Network, which remains to this day the most important institution in the field of antitrust. So we've looked at a variety of evidence here, quantitative and qualitative, and I think that it leads to a single sort of set of theoretical and policy conclusions. So theoretically, I think we see strong evidence that domestic politics and these big domestic shifts that have been occurring in the arenas of powerful states have been driving the design of these institutions. And it's not to say that functionalist and power-based explanations are wrong. They actually do tend to tap into some important causal dynamics. But these ones appear to be especially important, and certainly we would be missing something really crucial to the story about the growth of informality if we neglected them. The policy implications are also very significant here. If it was only functionalist explanations that was, or functionalist dynamics that was driving these institutions, then we would actually have a pretty good expectation that these institutions would be well matched with the problems that states face, that there would be a good design on average and a presumption of effectiveness. But if there's other things going on, domestic politics and power-based dynamics, then we don't have any sort of necessary relationship between design and problem. And it's possible that they're mismatched in many cases. And in the very final part of the book, I actually try to use the data that I presented to you before in order to evaluate how big of a concern that is. And it suggests that we do have some reason for concern. In fact, informal and international organizations are more likely to be mismatched with the problems that they face or that they're ostensibly designed to address than for their formal counterparts. And because they've been growing more over time, institutions that are mismatched in this way seem to be becoming a much larger part of the governance arrangements that we have on hand, which is a really concerning outcome. And it suggests that some of the sort of more optimistic claims that you might hear about informal institutions from the Anne-Marie Slaughters of the world or the Jake Sullivans of the world might be not completely warranted. We have some reason to be skeptical about these claims. Now, as I mentioned, I wanted to just briefly touch on some more recent sort of things that I've been working on that might modify this picture that is really the way that the book concludes. Not totally, but it's something that I want to note. So first of all, one of the things that this book does is it primarily focuses on OECD states. Now, they're the most important from the perspective of the actors creating international organizations by the simple fact that they are responsible for the creation of the majority of IOs that we have on hand. And so what I've described here is going on, then that's actually explaining a big part of the story. But other kinds of states are becoming more significant creators of informal and international organizations generally. They're becoming more important creators as well. And so this theory doesn't necessarily explain those states, but I think in the future we need to understand what's going on in those cases much better, because it's going to become a more important feature of the global landscape moving forward. And so as a first step in that direction, with Sam Rowan at Concordia University, we've been collecting data on all of the membership in informal international organizations. And we're starting to get a much clearer picture of this wider global landscape, where we do see sort of interesting innovation across region and states, much of which we don't understand yet. But with this new resource, we're going to be able to hopefully have some better answers to those questions soon. The second thing is that we need to understand processes of institutional change and interaction. So after these institutions are created, they rarely stay still. Sometimes they become more formal, sometimes they get new features, and sometimes they interact with other kinds of bodies. And sometimes that could be happening in ways that modifies the picture that I've presented already. And in fact, in Journal of European Integration, I have a piece out that discusses the kind of role that formal international organizations can sometimes play as coral reefs around which these informal institutions can kind of latch on and gain new capabilities and operate in a way that might compensate for some of the inadequacies of design that I've already described earlier. So I think that that's a more hopeful dynamic that deserves more attention. And related to that, though, we need to understand their effectiveness, their legitimacy, and accountability. And with this new data, hopefully we can do that better. But perhaps even most importantly, we need greater dialogue across disciplines that are focusing on informality in different senses, and also focusing on different issue areas like the environment, bringing it back to the area that I started from, and also bringing in other theoretical traditions. So one of the traditions that I haven't discussed that hasn't been as prominent in this debate about informal IOs is constructivism, for instance, or practice theory. But I think that actually these other research traditions tap into causal dynamics that are here as well, and we need to have more engagement in order to understand what's going on with them. So I'll leave things there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions now or by email or Twitter, as you prefer.
Thank you. Lots of food for thought. I have a few questions, and so I'll start off, but those of you who are online, please feel free to type your questions in the question and answer. And those of you here, feel free to formulate it in your mind. So the first question I have is kind of, why is this all so important? You've shown us that like there are a whole lot of formal IOs, and that increasingly, I think we saw roughly 1/3 of the total population of international organizations are informal, compared with 2/3 formal by the end of your data set. And what I could take away was two issues. One is that they're less binding because the legality means states are just, you know, forming clubs or small groups, but there's not that high level of obligation and precision. So Kyoto Protocol versus Copenhagen. And the second is this mismatch point. What does it mean for there to be a mismatch? Because you sort of mentioned it, and obviously I want to hear a little bit more. Why why do you think these informal IOs are problematic, or we shouldn't at least be so optimistic about them as Anne-Marie Slaughter or others are?
So thank you for these questions. Yeah, so this is, a question that I always wanted to understand from the beginning, right? Why does it matter? And I think that it's a question we should ask of all of our research. Hopefully we're not just, I'm probably interested in things just because that's what's out in the world, but I like it to also have some greater import, right? And I think that it was important for me to address the motivations behind the growth of informality, almost specifically because of people like Anne-Marie Slaughter, who offered them as sort of, in her words, a blueprint for governance in the 21st century. They were actually looking at these types of institutions and saying, this is what we need to do more. She referred to formal international organizations, by contrast, as the slow-moving dinosaurs of the international landscape, presumably with the implication that they're on their way out. And I think that her work is totally inspirational, right? But at the same time, I thought that she gave a far too optimistic view of many of these institutions. And that's not to say that they don't work in certain instances, but we needed to have greater questioning. And in order to do that, while we had some questioning out there, we needed a more sort of data-driven approach, let's say. So I wanted to get at that and see, is that claim supported or is it not, right? And answering the question about the origins of informality, about the reasons why it's being created, is one way in order to do that. And so that brings me to sort of the question of the mismatched, right? Because the basic idea is you have to buy into rational design theories of international institutions first, right? And I don't necessarily totally buy into it, but you need to sort of start from some place, right? And the idea behind Barbara Coraminos's work, for instance, is that states are rational actors and they're trying to design institutions in ways that efficiently solve their problems, right? And they identify a number of characteristics of problems. And the expectation is, on average, they're designing them in sort of an efficient way with this presumption of effectiveness, right? She would probably deny that somewhat, but it's very easy to be drawn to that conclusion, let's say, right? So in the way that I do this, the presumption behind sort of the figures that I quoted to you about more mismatched or less mismatched is basically using these ideas about what would these theories, if they were right, predict about these institutions' design. Should it be more formal or should it be more informal, right? Given the nature of the problems in the respective areas that they're trying to address. Now, after that, we can then look at the actual results. Which ones are informal and which ones aren't informal? And then we result in some categories of some institutions where there seems to be a good match, some where there's not a good match, and some other things to kind of in between, right? And so it's there that that sort of leads to the conclusion that there's something going on with informal institutions where they tend to be sort of mismatched, at least from the perspective of what kind of the best rational design kind of theory suggests should be happening. And in the book, it's only a footnote, so it's easy to be missed, but I do kind of try to speculate about why that is. Why would informal international organizations be more likely to be mismatched than formal ones? And there's sort of two reasons that I give for that. On the one hand, it's possible that things can either be, assume that they can be matched or mismatched or whatever, or that they need to be formal or informal in order to respond effectively to a problem. If they go the formal route, it's very likely that you end up with a number of essentially false negatives, right? Where they try to go the formal route, but because of domestic constraints, it's not ending up as a formal institution. It becomes informal. And that process can explain a large number of cases that are mismatched, right? On the reverse side, you don't have the same dynamic. It's possible that independent agencies propose informal solutions, but who's going to question it, right? It's possible that at times the area becomes politicized, but maybe not at the time that they're being created. And so as a result, of those two dynamics, if you are imagining them playing out more and more frequently over time, it's possible to explain why you would have a fairly good number of matched institutions in the formal category and mismatched ones in the informal one. And I'll just finish off by saying, I mean, one of the things that I think we always need to keep in mind, especially when we're studying international organizations, is that things like that we tend to focus on, like the International Monetary Fund or the United Nations, these are the most prominent examples of international organizations, but they are not representative of the typical international organization. There's literally hundreds of these things doing all sorts of important work in their respective areas, most of which are flying under the radar. And we tend to focus on these big ones that have problems, right? Or are tackling enormous issues. Whereas the average one is, performing, we were talking about Joanna Yao's work, performing the function of running traffic on a river system, right? Or smaller, more compartmentalized issues. And the vast majority of them work pretty well, to be honest, for what they're designed for. I mean, I don't have precise empirical support, but a lot of them are just doing important work, right? And it's important to not be distracted, I think, like the Anne-Marie Slaughters of the world are, by I don't want to pick on her necessarily, but like by the people that are very critical of formal international organizations by focusing only on the United Nations or something like that, right? Because there's all sorts of other things going on. And likewise, the same risk with informal institutions. Focusing on a few particularly successful examples isn't necessarily representative of the broader trend. And so what I'm doing in this book is to try unpack and understand that.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question and then I'll open up. And I think it's an important point to say you want to give a total population and a much broader view of international organizations and global governance beyond the UN, beyond the World Bank. Yet the story and the explanations you tell, and you acknowledge this at the end, is about a liberal order built by the US and the EU, right? It's quite a narrow explanation in some ways. Yes, they're influential countries and they're influential cases, but in light of a much broader questioning, which you note about the fact that there's other countries, i.e. China, other Asian countries building institutions that are not democratic, that may not see the same pathway of bureaucratic politics and politicization. How does your theory work in light of that? And I'm even thinking small liberal states like New Zealand might not fit these examples always so well, because small liberal states often like formal institutions. New Zealand's a great champion of the WTO, and there's bipartisan support for it because countries like New Zealand or Australia or Canada often want formal, precise rules so they can hold to account the great powers. So I wonder, just pushing you a little bit on, yes, your theory is convincing when we think of the cases you hold, but what about small states and or non-democratic states?
Yeah, that's a really important one. So I haven't, I don't have necessarily a starting presumption of the model that I presented to you is that it should operate within certain scope conditions. One is sort of a time restriction that we can talk about, which is important to what we mean by international law. But then the second one is more of a geographical restriction, which is limiting it to liberal democratic states for the most part. And so that's important for thinking about. And I think that as we move beyond that set of states, this model has less and less applicability. Now that's okay for the larger story that I tell for the most part, because in fact, it's those institutions that have created the majority of international organizations for the most part. At least a good chunk of them, right? but these other cases are becoming more important, and it will behoove us to sort of understand what's going on. Now, do I have a good explanation? No, I don't yet. At least not a domestic political one, right? Because there could be other dynamics that are going on in these particular cases that aren't strictly speaking anything like the one that I've envisioned, right? They could be other domestic political processes that are relevant to non-democratic states, for instance, and we'll need entirely new models in order to do that. But it could be that when it's also a authoritarian state where, let's say, the autocrat has exclusive competence over foreign policy making, more or less, then it's possible that some of these other explanations, like power-based explanations, might sort of hold more water in that particular context. Just an idea. And then about New Zealand, I can't speak about New Zealand specifically, but I want to also just say, like, what I've described is, I think, a really important dimension of what's going on. It would be our view of this process would be impoverished in some way if we didn't take into account, but it's by no means the only one that's operating. And I think what you just described is actually well described by those power-based explanations, right? Which I do think actually are really important. And so I don't want to give the impression that I find some mixed evidence, but I do think that they are important, and actually suitably revised in certain ways. I think they can actually be stronger than the version that I present in the book, which is just taking off the shelf sort of what other people have said. But I think more revised versions that are attentive to the dynamics of these states might actually even be more powerful.
Great. Let's open it up. Please put your hands up so I can see you clearly. We'll have, actually, I'm going to start with a student. I can see the faculty, Francesca, and then, yeah.
Thank you very much. I have two questions and I need to look them. Okay. So something I really find interesting, and I really want to hear your thought on that. Because we see this rise of informality, what do you think, to what extent is going to affect also already established and institutionalized international organization, like, for example, the European Union or institutions that are already highly formalized? Will they affected by this rise of informality or not? What do you think? And also that is, I think it's very, very relevant, the role of domestic policy. And to this extent, as we say that basically preferences are created within on the domestic level, right? And then when we move to the international level, there's like this bargaining power. But if the majority of our preferences are already established at the domestic level, then when we move to the other level, to what extent actually is a bargain, and to what extent actually we have space for maneuver and to change again our preferences? Okay, so that's it.
Thanks, Francesca. Well, take a couple. Is there any other student? Yeah.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can give an example, like a practical example of one of the mismatches you talked about, and how do you qualify or define this?
Thank you. We'll take one more, if that's right. Maybe Tito at the front.
Just a couple of questions. The first one regards the mismatch on the informal institution. I would like to know to which extent this is driven by the impossibility to pass anything through the US Congress in the last 25 years. So the question is that, is it possible in your empirical analysis to take the US out and to see to which extent your result work once we take the US out? Because in many cases, people need the US as part of the formal agreement, but the US would never be able to deliver anything. Linked to these two small things. One, the other thing I think about alternative explanation, I understand preferences, but I also, many of the example I see is the things that can be self-enforceable through cooperative or non-cooperative agreement versus the ones that needs the law. So in the sense, it seems to me that in the case of the IMF, once we have loans, you need some enforceability, while if you're in the GATT system, is just more bilateral things. And the last thing that I wanted to link is to which extent cannot it be the case that some informal organizations are supported by the formal one. I'm thinking, for instance, about the role of the IMF in enforcing the Basel supervision rules. So at some point you can have basic rules, but once the enforcement comes, you can use the formal organization as an enforcer.
That's probably enough for the first round, and then we'll come back.
These are great questions. Okay, so Francesca's question about what is the effect on formal IOs. This is actually, I'm really curious to know as well, to a degree, right? One thing that I think that is happening, which I discuss a little bit in my in the paper on the coral reefs of global governance, is that they are interacting with these informal institutions in various ways, and it speaks in part to this question as well, through things like, for instance, enforcement of Basel Committee standards by the IMF in various programs, right? So on the in part, some of these formal IOs are looking at informal ones as instruments that they can use, right? And in some cases, there might be good. Yeah, I don't want to use the word matches because it's already sort of defined in this talk, but they can find sort of partners to work with, right? Where they can both do things through informal IOs because of their advantageous characteristics, right? They can be more flexible or do certain different things, but at the same time, they can actually potentially increase the potential of these institutions by sharing some of their own resources, right, or their enforcement capabilities in some cases, right? And so I think that through these interactions, you're starting to see some new kinds of institutional alignments between formal and informal IOs, which mean that story about mismatched institutions, while it's probably true if you only consider them on their own, right? But is being modified to some degree because they're actually cooperating together in various ways, right? And so that's one thing that I think is important, but it's actually not well studied. And the perspective from the vantage point of formal IOs is, I think, still the least well understood part of that story. Okay, so when preferences, I've sort of thought about this as well, right? I'm like, so they form these preferences in the prior stage, and then they come, and then those preferences kind of don't matter for at least some states, right? And I think that you have to take into account the way that I like to think about it is that, these things can become foregone conclusions at that level, right? If an independent agency comes up, and there's actually cases of this where they have to interact with a ministry, then sometimes they might have that preference, but then they can't maintain it, right? That's what they go into the negotiations wanting, but it's not what they get out of the negotiation, right? They have to kind of give it up in order to reach that agreement. And that's where this like bargaining power comes into play, right? The other thing that might happen, which is not reflected in this theory, is some drop out, right? So there's some organizations where the UK is a bargaining party, and they're super important for negotiating this international organization, but then they actually never end up signing up to it. This happens in a couple of cases that are actually in the quantitative analysis, and it was like a struggle to know exactly what to do. But presumably, their preference was hard enough, and that when push came to shove, they actually just look for the door, essentially. So that's another way. Presumably all of the other cases are ones where New Zealand, who can be pushed around by the United States and just has to go along with it. I don't mean to that's actually the case. I'm from Canada. So I think that's sort of what's going on, right? Like they come to that with this is what their ideal outcome is, but they can't always achieve that. Right. So examples of a mismatch. There's a couple that I can think of. But one that's like especially clear is actually the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So the original motivation for creating the Basel Committee was actually in the wake of some sort of several banking crises that had happened. And the initial idea behind it, largely promoted by the UK, was that they wanted an early warning system, okay, for financial crises and to share information about banks that were at risk in their various jurisdictions. And when they came together, this is the motivation for creating the institution. They came together and they had discussions and they said, well, in order to do this, we're going to have to create a formal international organization, but none of us want that. So let's just have meetings and share information together. And so that's a particular case where they actually kind of wanted or recognized that in order to do what the original motivation for the organization was going to be, they had to go more formal, let's say. But in order to maintain the informality, which they all strongly preferred, they basically jettisoned the functionality of that institution, right? At least for that purpose. Now, the Basel Committee went on to various other things that weren't sort of related to that initial motivation, but I think that story nevertheless gives you an idea of, in the sort of worst case scenario, what can happen in terms of that mismatch emerging, right, as a result of these preferences coming into conflict with what functionality might suggest, I guess. Okay. So about the United States. So the United States is a big part of the story, okay? And I mean, it features in every one of the case studies that I've suggested. But I don't think it's the only one. And in the book, there are some efforts to test this exact possibility, like what happens if we remove the United States. And I can only do that so convincingly, let's say, in the particular approach that I take in this book. However, in some work that's at present unpublished, that takes a completely different analytical strategy towards understanding this, where we can actually just like drop all observations related to the United States. We still see the same pattern of actors that have more constraints or more independent agencies involved in the negotiations still displaying this preference for informality. And of course, the United States is a big actor because it creates so many of these institutions, right? But it's by no means the only one. And regionally, we see similar patterns, and we can disaggregate in different ways. So I don't have a full answer for you for that yet. But what I see in that, and I think it's a real concern, is suggest that it is a larger story, even if the United States is a big part of it, right? So the second point, I think I touched on a little bit about the coral reefs, right? Like, I think that this actually is something that can boost the effectiveness of these institutions quite a bit, the IMF interacting with the Basel Committee in just this kind of way. And I think that that's actually hopeful, because a lot of these trends that I've been looking at in the book, they're kind of difficult to know what to do about them, right? There's not sort of levers that policymakers can easily pull to solve the problem of polarization of domestic political arenas to make this problem in the United States go away. But the kind of sort of more, let's say, technocratic solutions of international organizations cooperating with each other in this kind of way is something that we have, let's say, more greater control over. And so that's kind of a hopeful dynamic, because it means that these institutions might be created in a problematic way at the outset, but we can actually do things to imbue them with greater capabilities over time.
One more round of questions. Veronica, you had one? And then we'll go.
Thank you, Charles. I think this was a very complete model and very coherent, and you've also established the scope conditions and so on. So any questions that we have are whataboutism at this point. So here comes one, right? If we increases the level of analysis just a level higher, there seems to be a group of very important informal networks, let's put them differently. So they're not informal organizations in the way you define them, but they have this similar qualities. There seems to be this other group that could be even more concerning, and we can't really ignore them. And it connects to this idea of the selectivity of policymaking circles. So an example of such an informal institution would be the Franco-German organization within the European Union that has had some consistent long-term, even detrimental effects, like the decision to organize the Minsk agreement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why was it a Merkel-Hollande thing? And this thing wasn't just a one ad hoc coalition, but it's something that has, in fact, organized European Union and its integration patterns throughout the years. And that level of informal organization is just another layer of complexity and that I wonder, how do we account for that? And that's what keeps me up at night. And so, and also if you think of other things like the East-West divide within the European Union, or the frugals versus the southern parts and so on, that have also determined how this union is going to act with impact in incredible forms going forward, that really doesn't have any kind of charter or formal understanding anywhere. So I'm just wondering where would you see such a research agenda going further if you look into that as well?
Thanks, Veronica. There was a question at the back, Lisa. Yeah.
Hi there, I'll stand up. Thank you so much for your presentation. As someone who's worked extensively on the domestic politics of foreign policy, I find a lot to engage with here. And I think there's a lot of really useful intersections with, as was said earlier, with bureaucratic politics, with two-level games, or I guess more accurately, with the arena in which, the design of the arena in which the two-level games will take place.
Mm-hmm.
So you, I think, smartly anticipated our questions about scope conditions and regime type and all that good stuff. So this is, I think, more one of those annoying comments than questions, because I just want to push a little bit more and see sort of how far you've gotten in terms of your thinking on that. As someone who studies more sort of the hybrid and authoritarian sets of regimes,
Mm-hmm.
I think you're going to find a lot more contestation within those regimes than you might anticipate. I think we often think of autocratizing and autocratic states as very centralized, but often those are very delicate power balances with perhaps a military or with other groups that could act as veto players. And so I'd be really interested to see sort of where you are so far in your thinking about how those domestic politics are playing out in authoritarian regimes. There's often, well, there's not the kind of democratic or electoral, although Jessica Weeks would argue that there is, not the same kind of electoral audience cost. There's often political patronage that allows the regime to stay in power that could serve as some kind of check on the sort of steps that the regime wants to take. I'm thinking of like when Erdogan wanted to take Turkey towards the Shanghai Cooperation, for example, and a lot of veto players in Turkey were like, absolutely not. And that was already when it was far on its autocratizing path. So one thing I was thinking you could possibly consider, because we have such a sort of concentrated and accelerated decolonization that's happened recently, even within Europe, are some of those regimes that we can study at, time T1, they're relatively democratic, time T2, they're much more autocratic. Do you see any kind of variation in terms of the dynamics that you're looking at? I thought that might be an interesting kind of set of cases to examine. But awesome work. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there was one more question. Sorry, here, I can't quite see what that is.
This came in talking about the Basel Agreement. Are there any noticeable patterns in the forms of agreements that each form of institution is like effective in? So would like informal institutions be more effective in environmental agreements or as opposed to like formal institutions or vice versa?
And I'm going to throw in one question that we have online, and that'll be the last one, which is from Dominique. This is quite a specific one. Have you been surprised by the strong attendance, 44 states, for the first summit of the European political community in Prague in 2022? does it confirm the trend towards informality?
Hmm.
So there you go.
well, how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay. Well, maybe I can, well, so Veronica's question, I mean, I think that, so I have sort of two thoughts about it. I mean, one is, how is what you're describing different from just everyday international politics, right? Like, not to say that there's not informal dimensions to that. Like within the European Union, there's actually a whole, a pretty well-developed literature on like informal governance, right? But this division into different bargaining coalitions or actors that tend to work together, right? Is that something that's unique or growing, or I mean, I think that there's interesting connections that arise between, Germany and France, or between these other states, that potentially lead to some kind of path dependent cooperation because they cooperated together in the past. And that's a really interesting phenomenon to understand. But I wonder where the like added value of like calling this like informality rests, right? And I'm not to say that it doesn't, but we often sort of use informal to describe all sorts of things, right? But is it necessary to bring something in order to understand just like, bargaining within an international organization and the formation of like bargaining coalitions which persist over time, right? And we can analyze those in the climate change regime and also in the European Union. And so where is informality coming in? And I'm not 100% sure, but we can talk more about it as well. One thing though that I do think is really interesting is that, and I think that the author's name is Weddell, and she has a book called Shadow Policymakers or something. And she's looking specifically at these like elite networks that form outside of governmental structures and that cross different policy communities. And there, I think the fact that they're kind of happening outside of official channels and linking states together is sort of, a useful way of thinking, like these are informal networks because they're not happening in any way whatsoever that like should be happening. And is that similar to the kind of phenomena that you have in mind? And if so, then maybe that's, a useful sort of angle into looking at it. I can get you the reference. Bureaucratic politics. Liza, I think that, did I miss something? I think that that's. So yeah, I actually very much in the book write this as being inspired by and using the sort of scaffolding of liberal intergovernmentalism and all of the theory that you mentioned. And so that's spot on. And I do consider it a kind of bureaucratic politics that's going on. I think that I need to read a lot more about non-democratic policymaking, right? And I know Jessica Week's stuff, and I know that there's a ton of stuff out there, but I just sort of haven't in my mind, like, I don't know whether this is exactly the like direction to go in, but if I think about like a smaller like selectorate that they are accountable to and that can throw up constraints, it's still sort of there, but I don't have a good idea of what like the preferences are going to be of the actors there in a sort of systematic way. And if you think about it from the perspective of independent agencies, my main concern with them in developing states, especially from the conversations that I had with policymakers in developing states, was that they kind of laughed at the idea that they were independent, right? And so it may raise the question of whether we can think about that policy process as well in the same way, and in what ways does that work, right? And so I really think that this is something that we need to understand more in order to advance this particular theory. And I have like the directions that you're talking about going are exactly the way that I would try to go about it, but I haven't had sort of the theoretical insight where it all clicks and comes together to so that this account can be extended or modified in some way to take those cases in account, despite the fact that I think it's really important. Yeah. But the empirical strategy that you're suggesting actually makes a lot of sense, right? And with Sam Rowan, we have an article out in Review of International Organization where we actually do try to use some of this data to retest some previous theories. And so we look at the Mansfield and Peavyhouse article about democratizing states joining informal or international organizations. And they use the correlates of war data set, which is only formal IOs, right? Where we kind of have reason to expect these benefits to be important for democratizing states. We don't see the same effect when it comes to informal IOs, right? So democratizing states don't seem to join more informal IOs in any way. Now, they also have some variable that is autocratizing states, and I just don't remember what it is because I don't know. We weren't focusing on that particular result because it's not the central conclusion of their paper, but it's there, so you can check it out. But I think that there's, that's only just sort of like going to be an indicative result that you might want to consult, but there's more to be done. Yeah. This question about whether they're more effective in certain issue areas is really interesting one. And I think that it's probably true. I mean, that's sort of the presumption of the rational design theory, right? That there's certain problems, but what I would say is that they're getting even more micro than that, right? Like sometimes talking about like, if what we mean by issue area is the environment or finance or something like that, we might have patterns that appear across those issue areas. And in the book, I do show that when it comes to design, there do appear to be some differences. But when it comes to understanding the effectiveness of the institutions, I feel like we need to be even more specific about what we're talking about. Is it appropriate to the specific problem in the field of climate change or biodiversity, however we define that, right? So I think that we do see prevalence of these institutions, but with the question of effectiveness is a somewhat separate one that I think requires a much more specific answer than I can give at the issue area level, let's say. And so I think that I believe in the intuition that there's sort of characteristics of a problem that can make institutions better or worse and more or less effective if they're appropriately designed. But I'd need to like say something more specific than the issue area though, right? So that's sort of my qualified answer to your question, right? Because I think it's true, but on a much narrower level than broad issue areas, as at least I'm conceiving it. And then about the European political community, I'm only just learning about the European political community and what's going on. Do I think that it's is the question that does it confirm?
Does it confirm the trend? Sorry, does it confirm the trend towards informality, given that so many states attended the first summit in 2022? Right.
Yeah, no, I think it does. I mean, I think it's a good example of the ongoing importance of this phenomenon, right? Where these things seem to be being created almost every single day now. In one way, shape, or form. And the European political community is a good example of that and emphasizes, I think, that we still have a lot of work to do in order to understand informality, including its effects, which I think should be a much more important question moving forward to give. Hopefully in the next time I'll have a better answer for you.
Thanks so much. I think that was a great talk and great to end on an empirical case that confirms your theory. But I think more to the point of those of you who are sitting who've taken my IR class or in other classes, I think what you've heard here is a really strong account of rational decision-making by states, the role of domestic institutions. And in fact, we're going to have a whole class on liberal intergovernmentalism, but also on the role of domestic politics. And I think what to keep in mind is also, what are the other theories out there that you might be learning in classes, whether it be the role of emotions in decision-making. I know my students last week talked about this, how much are emotions driving decisions, right through to constructivism. You mentioned sociological institutionalism. So this is part of a big, interesting set of questions about how do we understand the nature of global governance and what's driving it. So please give a big round of applause. Thanks so much. And I'll make one small pitch, which is we will be having in mid-April, Professor Faulkner, who's coming to talk about global environmental governance and taking a much more historical bent and looking at the last 100+ years and how states have evolved the responsibility to protect the environment. So please come along and join us for that. Thanks so much.
And sociological dimension
Yeah,
as well. That's great. Robert's going to be here.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, I've been trying to get him for a while. He's on sabbatical and he's in Munich, so I think it was a bit easier. Thank you so much for your help.
You know that he has a place in Umbria.
I do. Yeah, he always calls me. He's like,